This video is sponsored by PCBWay. Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be working on this broken HP Z4G4 workstation computer, which I'm hoping should be pretty interesting. That's mostly due to the fact that this system runs a platform that I've never worked with before, that being LGA 2066, and supposedly, I've got an i7-9800X CPU in this computer. So let's start with what's wrong with this system, or at least what's wrong with the system according to the eBay seller that I bought it from, which if you've watched my previous videos, you know is pretty often at least somewhat inaccurate. According to the eBay seller, this computer doesn't boot up, and when it's plugged in, its fans and power lights spin and illuminate indefinitely. But the system never gets anywhere past that point, so it doesn't pass post. Also, the seller mentions that sometimes the power indicator flashes red, and all of this has led them to state that they believe the issue may be the power supply. Finally, for the described issues with this computer, and this was something that I could see from the listing photos, it appears that the CMOS battery socket got broken off of the motherboard at some point. And so, let's go ahead and open this system up to get a good look at what we're dealing with internally before applying power, and also so that I can add a few components to the system that will be needed to properly test it. With the side panel off, the internals of this system look very similar to the internals of the good old HP Z440 workstation, one of the budget computing community's favorites. After removing the memory fan assembly, we can get a closer look at the motherboard, which, in typical HP fashion, is so close to being standard, if not for the proprietary power and I/O connectors. Apart from that, we have 8 DIMM slots and several PCI Express slots, which aligns with the fact that this is a workstation computer running an HEDT or high-end desktop platform. And all of these slots I'm talking about pertain to us right now because I need to install a stick of RAM and a GPU into the system to see if it will post, as the seller included neither of these and this CPU doesn't have integrated graphics. So, with a random stick of DDR4 memory installed in DIMM slot 0 and a GPU in one of the PCI Express slots, I connected a monitor, keyboard, and mouse to the system and then applied power to it. Like the seller had described, the system immediately turned on without me even touching the power button, and the system stayed on for a while but did absolutely nothing else, except flash its power button light at me. What was weird about this flashing though was that instead of a more standard on-off flash code, this LED was flashing between dim red and bright red 3 times. After consulting the Z4G4's documentation, it doesn't seem like this is a standard error code at all, which makes it really strange to me. I also noticed that the power button was completely unresponsive, regardless of how long I held it for. Super weird behavior right out of the gate, and honestly, a showing that doesn't align with power issues, at least in my experience. Plus, even though we have that missing CMOS battery holder issue, that shouldn't stop this particular model of workstation from posting based on my research, and it definitely shouldn't cause this. And for those who may be unaware, the whole battery socket missing from the motherboard is really no worse to the system than the socket being empty. The only difference is that it's much harder to install a new CMOS battery in this case. But I should be expecting the standard behavior for this model without a CMOS battery present, which I can promise is not what I'm getting. So I started digging around in the system a little bit deeper, and immediately found a connector that wasn't plugged in, seemingly related to that front power button. I doubt this is the issue at hand, but I plugged it in to see if the behavior changed at all, which it didn't. Even the fact that the power button had no influence over the system's power state ended up remaining the exact same. Now, a big challenge with working on this system for me is that my part swapping abilities are very limited right now, and what I mean by that is that I don't have another LGA 2066 motherboard that I can use to test this CPU out, or a spare power supply that fits this system so that I can rule out the PSU. I also don't have another CPU to make sure it's not that. Therefore, I've got to take a bit of a different troubleshooting path than maybe I would usually take to get the answer as quick as possible. That means that my next plan of attack is to pull all of the major parts of the system out of the case, that being the motherboard, CPU, RAM, power supply, graphics card, and cooler, and then I'll attempt to boot this platform up outside of the case with no peripheral components attached. This will rule out any of the weird things that do happen sometimes, like the motherboard shorting out on the case, or a shorted front USB port causing the system to fail post. But before I try and get things powered up outside of the case, I am going to take a second to check out the power supply. I already seriously doubt that it's the issue, but the seller said they thought it was, and I'm certain that this seller has many more resources than me to try things like a new CPU and motherboard in the system. So there's a chance that maybe they did some testing and know something that I don't. Hence, I think it's at least worth my time to check it and rule it out if it's not the issue like I think it is in this case. But since the output connectors are proprietary and I couldn't find a good pinout diagram online for this power supply, I wasn't really able to see if it was giving the right voltages on its outputs from the connectors. I was sadly going to have to go inside the unit and pull right from the connection points on the board. Now, I strongly recommend that you don't open computer power supplies at home. The reason being that there can be extremely dangerous voltages within these units that remain present even after power is cut because of the large capacitors inside the power supply. In fact, my unit's capacitors were still charged to 220 volts when I got inside it, and that's quite dangerous. So again, I strongly advise against opening computer power supplies unless you're absolutely sure of what you're doing. In any case, inside the power supply, I was able to see all of the connection points for the different voltage rails, of which this unit has many, and I checked the voltage of each rail to make sure they were in the right ballpark. I then created this setup with 2 multimeters and a dummy load that allowed me to probe each rail and read its voltage while also drawing some current from it, just to ensure that none of them were falling apart under load. Everything ended up testing perfectly, and this, combined with an always green self-test indicator light on the back of the power supply, makes me fully confident that I can rule this part of the computer out as an issue. So now, I moved on to testing everything outside of the case like I had been planning to, which with this setup was actually quite easy due to the onboard power button that HP puts on this motherboard. Thanks for that one, HP. But sadly, the behavior of the platform was identical in this situation when compared to what it had been doing inside the case. I tried switching out the GPU just to see if it would make a difference, but that changed nothing either. At this point, I wasn't too sure where to go next, but while thinking about my next move, I touched the CPU heatsink and noticed that it was ice cold. Now, obviously, this system isn't working too hard right now, so the CPU cooler shouldn't be working that hard either. However, the system had been on for several minutes at this point, and any healthy desktop system should be sitting with a minorly warm heatsink at this point due to the idle power draw of the CPU. And I'd especially expect this with a big CPU like the i7-9800X. The fact that this heatsink wasn't warm at all indicates that the CPU might not have been receiving power, which definitely helps to narrow down where the issue could be. But to confirm this, I pulled the heatsink off, gave the CPU a reseat for good measure, and then turned the system on while feeling for whether or not the CPU got hot. And it never did. In fact, very little on the motherboard was getting hot at all when looking through the thermal camera. Only 3 hotspots showed up on the camera, 2 were some small power supply circuits, and the other was the die of the SIO chip. All of them were within temperatures that I'd expect them to be within, so I don't think any were indicative of a short, but it was certainly interesting to see that literally nothing else on the mainboard was getting warm, meaning that nothing else on the motherboard was being told to be given power. Now, I know that many of you are probably wondering at this point about the missing CMOS battery and how that might be affecting this behavior. But here's the thing, this kind of failure isn't something that I'd expect from a dead or missing CMOS battery at all, even though I've had dead CMOS batteries stop systems from posting before. This is because in those instances, the system didn't post, but the CPU, chipset, and memory always got power, which I know for a fact because they heated up. Plus, it would make absolutely 0 sense for a dead CMOS battery to cause a complete power failure. And this also doesn't line up with what this model of computer supposedly does when its CMOS battery fails, at least according to my research online. But it would be silly of me to not at least check it still. I mean, I'm in deep enough that I'm probing around inside a PC power supply while it's plugged in. I don't think that soldering a new CMOS battery socket onto the motherboard to test with a new battery is too crazy. But before I do that, I'd like to first take a minute to talk about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. Because if you like this kind of deep troubleshooting of devices, you might find what they offer incredibly useful. PCBWay is a company that offers high-quality custom manufacturing services, including things such as PCB manufacturing and assembly, CNC machining, sheet metal production, and 3D printing. I've used their services many times, and the ordering process has always been simple, and the resulting products have never failed to make my project feel more polished and professional. Plus, you have to check out their 12th anniversary sale, which is going on right now. You can participate in some fun mini games, earn some coupons, and take advantage of some other sales that they're running. Namely, special colors like purple, matte black, and pink that would usually cost more are now discounted to the same price as the standard PCB colors. Plus, you can also get up to 50% off of their 3D printing service. So if you like to fix and build things, go ahead and check out PCBWay at the link in the video description, and make sure not to miss out on their 12th anniversary event. Anyway, as a very quick and dirty way of testing the board with a CMOS battery in it, I grabbed a socket that can hold a standard CR2032 cell and 2 wires, which I used to connect the socket to the pads where the old socket used to be connected. If this turns out to work well for the motherboard and it starts working, then I'll solder the socket directly to the PCB like it was from the factory. But again, I don't really expect this to work and therefore don't want to spend the time doing a beautiful and clean job just to throw the motherboard in the scrap pile when it doesn't work. In any case, the socket is connected now and I've installed a cell, so let's mess around with the board some more and see if anything has changed. Sadly, even with a CMOS battery installed, the exact same behavior can be seen, with absolutely no power to 90% of the board, minus those 3 spots seen earlier. I even probed the outputs of the CPU's VRMs to see if there was any sign of life there, but as expected, I couldn't see anything resembling a standard V-core voltage. So at this stage, I think I may be able to say pretty confidently that it's a power failure at the motherboard level. I think the PSU is giving the motherboard plenty good power, but something has gone wrong on the motherboard that's causing it to halt very early in the boot process, so much so that it never applies power to 90% of the components on it. So after heading onto eBay and finding a reasonably priced replacement motherboard, I ordered it and waited a few days for it to arrive. Once it was here, I quickly swapped it into the system, transferring over all of the other components and making sure to add my GPU and DDR4 DIMM so that the system would actually be able to post. Except it didn't. I applied power, and the system booted up right away, gave me a nice white power LED, and then proceeded to sit there doing absolutely nothing. So I started with the basic stuff again, because the likelihood that this motherboard is dead as well is incredibly low. So there's probably something else wrong. I first checked the CMOS battery, which was alright, but I still chose to replace it, and this, even when paired with the CMOS reset, didn't change the behavior. Okay, so maybe it has to do with the memory. I grabbed the slowest stick of DDR4 that I have, some base speed 2133 MHz stuff, and threw that in there, but still I got nothing. Now, while this new motherboard clearly hasn't fixed the issue entirely, I will note that the system is at least far more alive than before, as the CPU, VRMs, and PCH were getting warm when the system was on. Plus, the power button was responsive, and of course, I wasn't getting that super weird dim to bright red LED flashing behavior. Therefore, even though the system still isn't working, it's clear that the new motherboard has at least changed some things and is likely a step in the right direction. I kept trying things like reseating the CPU, trying the platform out of the case again, booting the motherboard without RAM and then without a CPU, and this is when I noticed some interesting things. In particular, the board would not throw an error when the CPU was installed even without RAM. However, it would throw a very clear no CPU error when I booted the board without a CPU in it. The board also never reached the point of USB initialization, so things like caps lock and num lock never responded on the keyboard. Knowing that the likelihood of this new motherboard being dead was very low, combined with the fact that the new motherboard is clearly getting farther in the process than the old one, and the overall weird behavior I've seen with this setup in general, all led me to believe that there might be a possibility that the CPU got taken out by whatever happened on the motherboard that killed it. So I bought a new CPU. Because again, I don't have any LGA 2066 equipment on hand, and therefore, swapping a new chip means that I have to go out and buy one. So with my second i7-9800X, I installed it into the system, and it didn't post, still. The behavior was the exact same as it was with the old chip, meaning that it's very unlikely the CPU is actually bad. So at this point, I frankly had no clue where to go next, so I turned back to the internet and did more research on the Z4G4 and why it may not be working still. With all of the symptoms I had, pretty much everything still pointed to an issue with the motherboard, but that can't be. It's brand new from a reputable seller. It was packaged well, and it just has no reason to be damaged. But after a while, I eventually realized that it likely wasn't damaged, as I expected, but instead, it was probably completely the wrong board. This is because it turns out that HP makes 2 different boards for the Z4G4 with different chipsets on them. One is an X299 chipset, and one is a C422 chipset. These boards look practically identical, minus the Xeon-only C422 board having a second Ethernet port and a second NVMe slot. Oh, and hey, would you look at that? My replacement board has exactly those 2 things. Now, of course, these two boards use the exact same LGA 2066 socket. Therefore, my i7-9800X fits in them both. But the C422 chipset cannot initialize an X series chip. This lines up with the fact that the board throws a no CPU error when there's no CPU, but won't throw a no RAM error when the i7 is installed with no RAM. That's because the CPU has to be initialized to be able to move on to even testing RAM, and the system doesn't make it that far because the board and the chip are incompatible. Alright, so I've bought the wrong motherboard and a CPU that I don't need. I'd say this is going great. Alright, so it's not ideal, but I can return the motherboard and the CPU wasn't that expensive. Plus, if I do anything else with LGA 2066, which I am planning to do, it could come in handy. To move on with the repair now, I found a motherboard on eBay that I was absolutely certain was the model that supports Intel Core X CPUs instead of the Xeon W chips and ordered one. Then, about 3.5 weeks and one motherboard lost by FedEx later, I'm not even joking, the punches just keep coming, I was finally able to try what I hoped would be the last thing this system needs to be able to post. So, with the correct replacement motherboard in my hands, I dropped it into the case, installed the original Core i7-9800X CPU, stuck in an 8GB stick of DDR4 RAM, mounted the cooler, wired everything up, and tentatively attempted to power the system on with a GPU installed so that we could get video output. But unlike before, this time, the system booted. I was able to get into the BIOS and installed Windows onto the computer with the addition of an NVMe SSD. Plus, once Windows was installed, the computer passed a Cinebench stress test with ease. So finally, I can say that this computer lives once more after quite a long and silly process. In the end, that original mistake with the motherboard was on me and was pretty stupid. I should have paid more attention to the exact part numbers as well as the few tiny feature differences, such as that extra Ethernet port and M.2 slot. If I hadn't made that mistake, I also wouldn't have come to the conclusion that the original CPU was likely toast as well and wouldn't have bought a second one. But oh well, we live and we learn. And thankfully, because I'm making a YouTube video on this project, I can afford to eat the extra cost of this fiasco. Oh, and wanna know a fun fact? About 1 month late, the motherboard that FedEx lost actually arrived. So now I've got an extra i7-9800X and matching HP Z4 G4 motherboard that I ended up getting for free because I had it refunded after not moving for 3 weeks. Guess it's time to start looking for a good deal on a broken Z4 G4 that needs a new motherboard because I've already got the parts on hand. But that's all that I have for you in this video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.